we've all been reading stuff. We've been reading some books, and they've all had to do with the themes of people being trapped. Now, whether that's literally or metaphorically, it depends on the story. So, I think we should just get right into the first book, which is Vampires in the Lemon Grove by Karen Russell. And it's just a series of short stories, and there's a few of them that we would like to talk about. So the first one is Reeling for the Empire. And if anybody would like to chime in at any point, feel free to do so. But basically, it's a story about how these girls they drink this potion and they become silkworms, where they essentially work in this factory to give silk. And eventually, the main character Kitsune works to rebel against the Empire, essentially, and break all of the workers free. So the primary essential when it comes to the entrapment is how the main character sees herself. Now, all of these worms are trapped inside this factory, made to work there for the rest of their lives. And it's when they realize that they're being trapped there, is when Kitsune and Dai they want to escape. So I think the methods that they were brought there is different between the characters. For example, all of the other girls, they were put in there by either their parents or someone they know, while Kitsune is different in the fact that she brought herself into this. So essentially, she trapped herself inside this hell, and all the others have been put there by someone else. And this leads to how being trapped does not necessarily have to be against your own will, in a way. So,
Yeah, and then later on, we learn about her friend Dai, who is really Tsune's best friend throughout her life in the factory. And while Kitsune starts thinking about revolting against the agent, who's like the leader that entraps them in the factory, Dai ends up actually sacrificing herself and dying, and her this color of her silk actually changes to black when she dies, which I thought was interesting. And she sort of her death is used to inspire Kitsune to sort of lead her revolt against the girls, which I think was very interesting.
yeah, it's kind of like how using that as a motivator to get out of the trap that they were put into, in a way. And the character going through a tribulation in order to be released from their trap is actually a common theme in a few stories, like an example, Proving Up, where you have the boy. I believe his name was Miles. I may be wrong.
I can talk about this one. So
okay,
His name was Miles, by the way.
Okay.
yeah, there's this boy named Miles, and the premise of the story is that it centers around the family trying to fulfill the conditions of the Homestead Act, where under certain rules, if they make a certain type of property, they're able to receive a free area of land to live on. So, but the boy, he has this obligation from his family, where he has this responsibility placed on him to go take a window around to all the different families so that they can all fulfill the obligations of the homestead. And so this is the first sort of example of entrapment in the story, because we see that he's sort of forced into undertaking this journey, which eventually gets him into a larger conflict later. And there's also a bit of an element of non-physical entrapment, because later we see that in the story he's confronted by this strange. And eventually, what's implied is that Miles is being held accountable for his father's actions on the prairie, which it's implied his father stole land or killed somebody or something.
Yeah, stole the window, I think. Yeah,
or stole the window, yes. And because of that, Miles is more or less trapped in a situation where he is, in fact, killed by the stranger. So there's an element in this story of physical entrapment because he's being made by his family to go out and take the window around. I
think the story did make a decent amount of deal on the pressure placed upon Miles by his father to do the windows to take the window to the next house over, because I think there was a lot of responsibility throughout the family, and I believe that he had like really wanted to prove it to his father, and he really felt that it was important to himself and his family for him to get this
Yeah,
done and do
it was sort of portrayed, at least to me. I interpret it as sort of a coming of age challenge, where
Oh,
he's
yeah.
doing this to like he's a younger kid, so he's doing this to sort of prove himself, his worth.
Yeah.
And another story that sort of fits this, well, not the theme exactly, but you know the overall theme of entrapment is another story by Russell.
I just want to
called,
say
The
that
Bomb.
I find it interesting how this story, entrapment is such a common theme, but the idea of like a prairie, like the frontier during this time, it's synonymous with like freedom.
All right, but do you think that goes against the idea of entrapment, or do you think that the characters still are trapped?
I feel like overall, the story, it's all about the idea of being trapped, but the idea of freedom in that, like, the frontier is about freedom is sort of in the background, how, like, many people in modern times, which is what the audience that Karen Russell is writing this for, since she wrote this pretty recently, many people have not, like, view the frontier as something that is synonymous with freedom and how it's all great, but she's trying to bring light to the fact that many people didn't feel that way and did feel like they were trapped.
I thought it was especially compelling because in the story, a lot of the characters are really desperate to get to that, their idealized view of freedom. Like for example, Miles I'm pretty sure mentions that some of their family members had died on the way there, and so they're giving up like their livelihood to try and attain this freedom, and then as a consequence of that, they're becoming trapped in this situation.
Oh yeah, wait, you bring up an interesting point about like what the steps you have to take to get to freedom. You might end up losing. Like by trying to achieve freedom, you might be trapped along the way. So going back to the first story, which is Reeling for the Empire, this story took place during the Meiji Restoration, where Japan pushed for its country to industrialize, and part of that was the production of silk, and this industrialization was supposed to lead to some sort of utopia, but in order to get to that point, you had to have all these people working in these factories and doing so under terrible conditions where they're sort of trapped.
Became like sweatshops, probably, right?
Yeah. It's I just as a clarification, it's Meiji. Just to make sure that it's like known. So, and I think that's actually interesting how it's like, okay, so you're working towards something, and then like as you're working towards it, you're kind of trapping yourself in something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that topic's actually explored a little bit in our third story, The Barn at the End of Our Term, in which you have these presidents which are reborn as horses. And it's a president, right? So it's someone who's worked their entire life in their political campaign, eventually is elected, and has like an agenda and is working as a president, right? Mm-hmm. And eventually when they die and they move on to their next life, they're just this horse who's trapped physically in this barn, and they can't necessarily leave. They see freedom, but they're not necessarily sure if they want to leave it because they're so used to building around them and working up that eventually they don't really want to leave that barn, that property that they've built up their entire lives. And I think that's kind of carried over in the second life when they're on the barn, right?
I actually saw another element to this because while that's the main premise of the story, I believe there's also references, I'm not sure which president it was, but some of the characters express a desire to escape the barn and go back to Washington and try to reattain their past livelihood or influence. And I thought it was interesting in that some of them, they're not even trapped in the confines of where they are, but they're trapped in wanting to go back into their previous life, and they're not ready to move past it.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of like two sides of the coin, right? It's depending on how you look at it. Each president thinks differently. Like some just think where they are right now is fine and they're okay with it. Others still have those aspirations, but they're trapped inside, so they have to somehow find a way to get out in order to continue on those aspirations. And I think that's actually a really interesting part of the story.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of wraps up what we need to say about the Karen Russell stories. If anybody has anything
those were
else they
the
want-
main examples of.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think now we should begin moving on to the second book, which is The Elephant Vanishes by Murakami. And there's three more stories that we would like to look at here. And I think we should start with the titular Elephant Vanishes, simply because, it's in the title. So it's it's about this man who is documenting an incident where an elephant and his zookeeper vanish without a trace one day. And he's basically trying to find out what happened, and he shows blatant signs of OCD and wanting to figure out this crime by looking at very meticulous things. And we can see this by the sheer amount of lists he makes throughout the story and wanted to keep everything in mind as he keeps writing. And we see that he's eventually starting to like trap himself in his mission to try and find the cause of this vanishing, because he's eventually building all of these like facts and logic around himself, and in the end he's just kind of like, I don't know, block and stuck, and he can't really think beyond those facts, and he's just trying to put them together. And yeah, that's basically the basic premise.
Yeah, and he keeps that a small journal with him, I believe, at like all times, where he writes down all this information about the elephant and everything that he sees and records with it. And even at the end, I believe he talks about when he sees what he thinks actually did happen with the elephant, and talks about why he thinks the elephant actually did vanish. But he mentions how he did not mention this information to the police, which I think goes even further to show his obsession with the idea of just his own investigation with the elephant, and really mentally being trapped into that idea of extreme OCD to one topic, being that elephant, in that case of like literally non-stop 24/7 surveillance and investigation and spectatorship. Yeah.
And speaking
I think
of
this I just want to say that I think this shows that like ignorance is sort of freeing in a sense. So if this person never saw this elephant, he wouldn't constantly be obsessed about it. So
like the elephant is kind of like a trigger in his brain that leads him to us. All right, so going back to how like involving the police and whatnot.
Yeah.
The second bakery attack is another story. I'm sorry, were you saying something, Keenan?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I just heard things in the background. So yes, this is a story about a man and a woman who have just started their relationship, and eventually they realize, they come to the conclusion that long ago some man put a curse on the man in the relationship, that they will experience this constant hunger. So they essentially recreate the scene of the robbery in which the baker cursed the man, and they go to a McDonald's and essentially rob it by taking 30 burgers, and they kind of they feel trapped by by the destiny of his wife, being with that relationship, and also the trap that was set by that baker so long ago. It all comes into play, And what the wife realizes is that if they're gonna have to break free from it, they're going to have to essentially prove to himself, like, recreate that scene and what should have happened.
Yeah.
Because he kind of just gets away scot-free because all he has to do is listen to the music, which presumably gives him the curse, and he gets all this free bread. So he's essentially wanting him to live with the consequences of that by recreating it as being the only way to cure him from his trap.
And I remember the narrator talks about in the beginning of that story about how events just happen and you have no control over that. And he talks about how that's sort of his view on life, how like you really have no control over what happens around you. And so when he talks about the events of him having to steal from a bakery, he really doesn't want to do it. Like he questions that. He says at one point, he says he regrets telling his wife that, but he says at the end of the day he did it. So he says, so they have to. And they go to that McDonald's at like 3 a.m. and they steal like 30 burgers because that's all they can find. Yeah.
Hey, they're resourceful, man.
Mm-hmm.
It's good. And
anything else about that?
Yeah.
I mean, no, I think that's it.
All right. So, speaking of relationships, our last story is the little green monster. And if anybody, I'm not too familiar with the story.
The premise is that there's essentially a woman, right? It's a housewife, and the implication throughout the story is that she's discontent with her rather boring life at home. And what happens in the story is that there's at least the way I interpreted it, is that there's a visualization of her discontent in this creature that appears in her garden. And long story short, she ends up killing this visualization, or the monster. And the way I took that was that she was, striking out against what she thought was a lifestyle that she wasn't content with. And the way she was trapped in this story was that she was physically, in the situation, she was still in this, livelihood. But that mentally she was sort of, breaking out of it.
What do you mean by that? The lifestyle that she's not?
Well, I mean, physically she is still like a housewife, and she doesn't seem to like the situation. So I guess you could construe that as being.
And her husband doesn't satisfy her. She feels her husband is always at work, and she feels she's at discontent with her life.
So you're essentially saying that the monster is an embodiment of that.
Yeah.
That lifestyle where you're basically essentially stuck in the house all day, and there's not really much you can do about it except just kind of wallow in your self-pity until she finds that monster and she realizes, wait a minute, I can do something with my life.
And it's a symbolic breaking out of the entrapment. I mean, it's not like, literal her leaving the situation.
Yeah, and I think honestly the most interesting part about the existence of the monster is that it could very well just be like a cognitive image in her brain. It could very well not be real at all, but we wouldn't know that, right? Because it's only really told from her perspective, and nobody else really can see the monster. At least if I recall. So
there's no other. I don't think there are any other.
There's
characters
no one else
in the story.
there. So
yeah,
you don't know that.
There's no one there. So essentially, the monster could very well not exist at all.
Yeah, especially because she has like the mental telepathy with the monster. They can communicate through their minds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird if you think about it. And
definitely.
also, it's the fact that she kind of created it as a way to break free from her trap in a way. Because it's kind of hard to think of the abstract idea of her lifestyle and try and tackle with that, but instead putting it into this monster and maybe dealing with it that way is an easier way for her to cope with it.
Yeah, in the past it would have been especially hard to break out of this like being a housewife,
Mhm.
since like in the past it was very difficult for women to find good paying jobs. So
Oh yeah.
this meant that women usually had to prioritize marrying someone that could provide for her and her family by having a decent job.
Yeah.
So this was like prioritized over marrying someone that actually cared about you and respected you. So I feel like this monster is someone that does care about her and does respect her, but she sort of rejects him because she's been programmed by society to have a certain expectation on like who the person she marries should be, and that person should be someone that makes a lot of money that could provide for her and her family.
I just checked, and Elephant Vanishes was written in 1993. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
this
it's
is
possible
kind
the story was from longer ago, but
yeah.
Well, it could be also that this is around the time where it was becoming more normal for gender equality to be brought to the public eye. So
Yeah.
and I don't know what gender equality was like in Japan, but I would
Yeah.
assume it was more
Especially
backwards.
around
than
it's
it was
actually
here.
Yeah.
it's
If
actually
anything,
yeah. So essentially, these are all different ways of looking at being trapped, both physically, mentally, socially. Like these are all
Yeah.
different stories of people being trapped by two different authors, and I think it's kind of interesting how both authors can see being trapped as something similar, because we all know of we all know that feeling of being trapped, right? But sometimes we can see it differently. Like if I look at the stories right now, Russell usually uses a lot more physical trappings, usually, but mostly by like supernatural means.
Yeah.
But there's still like physical barriers. While I think Murakami usually uses more like mental, social barriers
Mhm.
that they may not even exist, but the idea is enough for these stories to be brought into fruition, and to like their very concept is enough for these characters to be trapped
Yeah.
in a way.
Mhm.
And I think that's just interesting. I think it's interesting to like see how these different authors look
Yeah,
at
I thought it was
being trapped.
interesting that they both incorporated, sometimes in the same story, elements of physical and mental entrapment in a situation. Like they both, like for example, in Proving Up, you sort of have the physical and psychological element, and then in Elephant Vanishes, it's the same thing where there's a physical, involvement in a situation that you can't get out of it, and there's a psychological like fixation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and given
Look-
that Murakami's like a man from Japan and Russell's a woman from America, you would think they have very different perspectives on what being trapped means, but
yeah.
this has showed that they're pretty similar.
Yeah, it's very universal in that regard, and
Mhm.
I think that is something very unifying, is how we all have similar emotions in a way, no matter where we are, who we are. It
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can see it differently, but we still have those emotions because we're all human. So
Yeah.
it's interesting in a way, and well, I think this was a very good and
Yeah.
interesting look at how these different stories treat the idea of being trapped, and how these people manage to work against their trap and liberate themselves by the end in most cases.
Mhm.
And I think that pretty much wraps it up. So thank you all. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
for coming. It's great to host this, and I'll see you guys
That was good, yeah.
hopefully next week.
See
yeah.
you guys.
Mhm.
See
Bye
ya.
bye.
All right.
But
And remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure you go to all of our social media. Make sure you go onto our Twitch and subscribe. That'd be great. Give us you can even do it for the tier
use our
one.
promo code on Audible.
Yeah, make sure merch link is in the bio.
You can
go to
listen to
my,
this
IB
on
lit.
Audible, our sponsor.
make sure you go to my Patreon, Streamlabs, my GoFundMe.
The apocalypse.
see you
is
next
gonna
time.
be
All right,
hard.
cut,
Yeah.
cut the audio. Cut the audio.
Like the
Bye guys. I'll see you.
All right.